Welcome back to the Biblical Life podcast, and today we're going to be talking about imperfection. Now, imperfection as Christians is something that we have to deal with on a daily basis, right? We are striving for this perfection to be like Jesus Christ, and yet we are never going to reach it. So, how as Christians can we deal with it? How can we actually be content in our life, knowing that in this life, we're never going to reach perfection? And I think if we look at Paul, he's a great example of, a guy who really strived to be Christ-like. Definitely messed up a couple of times, as we all do. But you could tell in the letters that he wrote, in the way that he's spoken about, that he was a man who really loved God and Jesus and wanted to be like him. And we can look at our imperfections in a very negative way sometimes. But at the end of it all, we have to understand that as every person in the Bible, we have our imperfections and we need to deal with them in the correct manner. So we can look at Paul or Saul, and if we go back to his story, which is in Acts 8 and Acts 9, where he's first spoken about. And the first part where he's spoken about, he's actually ordering people to stone a man, to stone Stephen. So his first act in the Bible is to get a man killed for proclaiming God's name. Right? So as Stephen is being stoned to death, he is calling the heavens down. He was a man after God. And so Paul comes through this transitional period of actually, I don't know God and I'm killing Christians. That was what he was doing beforehand, until he meets Jesus on Damascus Road, right? And when he meets Jesus, he goes through this transition straight away. Like when he meets him, he knows it's God. And I think then and only then is he renamed Paul, right, by Jesus. And we have to understand that actually God is going to use our imperfections. And if we look at Paul, we can look at David, who was a man after God's heart and yet still fell to sin. Or we can look at Peter, who denies Jesus 3 times. Every individual is going to have an imperfection. And we can do one of two things with it. We can either allow it to hold us back, or we can actually use it to push us forward and try and stray away from those things. But also, the imperfections we have, especially maybe as somebody that isn't a purposeful Christian, at this moment in time, you might not be working for God. But God is going to use every characteristic and every trait that you have for him in a positive manner. Sometimes we think that actually God can't use me because I'm like this, or God isn't going to use me because I'm like this. But we can look at Paul again, and he was so stubborn, so very stubborn. And yet God used his stubbornness and his drive together to make him into this disciple who wrote, 13 books in the New Testament. And I'm sure that Paul didn't see that happening when he was killing Christians. We can look at Peter, who was a man who, he would take action first and think later. When he cuts off the guard's ear when they come to get Jesus, that's an act where he was not really caring about what was happening. He acted on it and then he thought about it later. So these are qualities that we might not really place high up on our list, but God is going to use them. Guarantee God is going to use them if you let him use these qualities. And so my advice as a Christian is that actually, once we are being purposeful, our imperfections don't matter. They're going to be there, they're always going to be present, but we need to really focus less on those things and focus on the good things we can do, right? And I was in a preach not long ago where the preacher was speaking about the A and B side, right? We have some A side qualities, we have some B side qualities. We have some qualities that we would rather not tell people about. That's going to be your B side. And then we have the qualities that we acknowledge and we talk about a lot. That's your A side. But we have to remember that there is no A without B or B without A. We're always going to have these qualities that we dislike or maybe not too fond of, but it's where your heart's at, right? And this is what it comes down to in a lot of topics in Christianity. Where's your heart? Are you doing certain things because it's for your own glory, because you want to have your own success, or are you doing it for God's glory? And I think once you can answer that question and be confident and say, it's not for me, it's for God. If you mess up, he'll redirect you. If you're really striving for him, and maybe your B side comes out a little bit, right? you get a bit angry, you're impatient, you gossip, whatever it might be, it's going to happen. But at that point in time, now what do? Are you going to sit in it? Are you going to dwell on it? Or are you going to accept that you're not perfect, right? And I'll use an example that recently I was speaking to a friend of mine, and I was talking to him for quite a long time, and he was basically telling me all the things that were wrong with his character. You know, he can't go to church because of this. He can't start have a relationship with God because of what he's doing. And I'm kind of sat back with it, and I appreciate it. And all I'm trying to do is almost convince him that it's okay and that it doesn't matter, right? God is going to love you. And then I find myself that same night going home talking to my roommate, and I was really struggling at this point in time with something in particular. I was like, I don't know how I can serve God if this is what I'm doing. I don't know how I can serve God if I'm going to be the person who's really tempted in by sin and is struggling with it. How can I serve God and also be a person who's struggling with these things? And so at that time, I remember speaking, and I just thought, I think the message I was giving him was more for me. You know, when we struggle, when we suffer, when we're going through it and we don't know what to do, it's going to be very difficult to try and acknowledge God's presence. And so I think that in those times, accept that you're imperfect and move on from it, right? And there's in 1 Timothy 1:12-17, it talks about, Paul is talking about a trustworthy saying. And when Paul says something and he's highlighting it, it's important. And so it says, it identifies that Paul is the worst sinner. It identifies that Paul is actually the worst of the worst and acknowledges his imperfection but moves forward with it. And so it's important that we do that. And I acknowledge you today that at this moment in time, acknowledge your sin, acknowledge your imperfection, and move past it. Idiots. Absolute idiots.